Your Roth IRA could be the single most valuable account you ever own. But here's the thing. Most people fill it with the wrong investments and end up leaving tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table without ever realizing it. And the strangest part is that the ETFs they pick aren't even bad ETFs. They're actually great ETFs. They're just sitting in completely the wrong account. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the 3 ETFs I genuinely buy and hold forever inside a Roth IRA, why each one earns its spot. By the end, you'll know exactly how to set up a Roth IRA that makes the most of every single dollar you put into it. I'm Andrew, and I make videos about dividend investing to help you make smarter decisions with your money. Let's get into it. Quick note before we start. I'm not saying you should hold all 3 of these at the same time in equal amounts. That's more of a portfolio construction question, and I'll touch on that towards the end. This is a list of the best candidates and how to think about combining them. Why the Roth IRA is so special. Before we get into the ETFs, I want to spend just a minute on why this account deserves so much thought in the first place. Because once you really understand what a Roth IRA does, the whole which ETFs should I pick question kind of answers itself. So here's how it works. You pay tax on the money before it goes into the account. That part feels a bit annoying because you're using post-tax dollars. But once that money is inside the Roth IRA, something pretty magical happens. Any dividends those investments pay you, you don't pay tax on. Any growth in the value of those investments, you don't pay tax on. And when you eventually pull the money out in retirement, you don't pay tax on that either. It is genuinely one of the only places in the entire US tax system where the government basically says, whatever this grows into, it's yours. We're not touching it. For 2026, you can put up to $7,500 into your Roth IRA if you're under 50, and $8,600 if you're 50 or older. That might not sound like a huge amount, but let me show you what it can turn into. If you maxed out a Roth IRA every single year from age 30 to age 65 and earned an average return of 8% per year, you'd end up with somewhere around $1.3 million. And every penny of that would be yours, completely tax-free. Even better, the growth on top of your contributions would be more than $1 million of that figure. Your actual contributions would be just around $260,000. So when you really sit with that, the question stops being which ETFs are good and starts being which ETFs make the most of an account I can never get tax on again. Because the more an investment grows inside a Roth IRA, the more valuable that tax shelter becomes. And that's the lens we're going to use for everything else in this video. The first ETF I'd happily hold forever in a Roth IRA is Vanguard's Total Stock Market ETF, ticker VTI. And honestly, if I had to pick just one ETF for someone starting from scratch, this would probably be it. It's that flexible. Here's what makes VTI so special. Most US stock funds only hold the biggest companies in the country, usually the largest 500 or so, like the ones in the S&P 500. VTI doesn't do that. It actually holds nearly every publicly traded company in the United States. We're talking about more than 3,500 companies in a single fund. Large companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Nvidia, but also mid-sized companies, small companies, and even tiny microcap companies you've probably never heard of. So when you buy one share of VTI, you're essentially buying a slice of the entire US economy in one go. And the beauty of that level of diversification is that you don't have to be right about which company or which sector is going to win. You just have to be right that, over the long run, the US economy keeps producing successful companies. Some sectors will boom while others stumble. But across thousands of companies, those swings tend to even themselves out. The fee on VTI is just 0.03% per year, which is basically nothing. About $3 a year on every $10,000 invested. To put that into perspective, the average actively managed fund charges anywhere from 0.5% to 1% per year, sometimes even more. So we're talking about a fee difference of more than 20 times for a fund that, in many cases, doesn't even outperform a basic index. That's why I always say keeping fees low is one of the easiest wins in investing. You don't need to be smarter than anyone else. You just need to stop quietly handing over your returns to someone else year after year. VTI also pays a small dividend of around 1.17% per year. That's much lower than a dedicated dividend ETF, which is exactly what you want inside a Roth IRA. The bulk of your return comes from growth, not dividends, so the tax shelter is doing its best work. The second type of ETF I'd consider for a Roth IRA is a growth ETF. And the two I'd point you towards are Vanguard's Growth ETF, ticker VUG, and Charles Schwab's US Large Cap Growth ETF, ticker SCHG. They track slightly different indexes, but honestly, both are perfectly good. It really does come down to personal preference. Both are also incredibly cheap to hold. VUG charges you 0.03% per year, which works out at about $3 a year on every $10,000 you have invested. SCHG is just slightly higher at 0.04% or $4 a year per $10,000. Either one is a complete bargain. So what's actually inside a growth ETF? Well, these funds invest in companies that are expected to grow their earnings faster than the market average. You're talking about a lot of household names in technology, healthcare, and consumer companies, the kind of businesses that reinvest most of their profits straight back into the business instead of paying it out as dividends. Because growth companies pay very low dividends, or sometimes none at all, almost all of your return comes in the form of price appreciation. The value of the ETF goes up over time, and you don't realize any of that gain until you actually sell, which means inside a Roth IRA, that growth compounds completely undisturbed for decades. It's almost like the Roth IRA and growth ETFs were designed for each other. But, and this is a big but, growth ETFs come with a trade-off. The same companies that have the potential for huge gains also tend to be more volatile. When the market gets nervous, growth stocks usually fall harder than the rest of the market. We saw this in 2022 when growth ETFs dropped by around 30% in a single year, while more diversified funds fell far less. So if you're someone who panics at the sight of red on your screen, a fund like this can test you in a way that a more diversified ETF wouldn't. So a growth ETF makes the most sense. If you have a long time horizon, you genuinely understand that volatility is just the price of admission for higher long-term returns, and you trust yourself not to sell at the bottom. If any of those three things is wobbly for you, that's worth being honest about before you commit. You might be better off just sticking with VTI on its own and skipping the growth tilt entirely. The third ETF I'd happily hold forever in a Roth IRA is an international stock ETF. The two I personally like are Vanguard's Total International Stock ETF, ticker VXUS, and the iShares equivalent IXUS. VXUS charges 0.05% per year, and IXUS charges 0.07%, still very low cost. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. International stocks have underperformed US stocks for over a decade. Why would I want to own them? And I genuinely understand where that's coming from. If you look at the last 10 to 15 years, US stocks have absolutely crushed international stocks. It hasn't even been close. And it's tempting to look at that chart and think, okay, the US is just better. Why bother with anything else? But here's where I want you to zoom out. The US hasn't always been the winner. In the 1970s and 1980s, international stocks actually outperformed US stocks for long stretches. In the 2000s, emerging markets had huge runs that left US stocks in the dust for years at a time. The reality is that no single region wins forever. Markets go through cycles, and they're impossible to predict in advance. You don't really know which decade is going to belong to which region, and the people who tell you they do know are usually the ones selling you something. What an international ETF gives you is exposure to companies all over the world. Toyota in Japan, Samsung in South Korea, Nestlé in Switzerland, ASML in the Netherlands, Tencent in China, and thousands of others. Both VXUS and IXUS hold companies of all sizes in both developed economies like the UK, Japan, and Germany, and in emerging markets like India, Brazil, and Taiwan. So you're getting a pretty incredible mix of stable, established multinationals alongside higher growth companies in faster developing economies. And the reason to hold something like this in a Roth IRA specifically is the same reason behind everything else on this list. If international stocks do start outperforming again, and historically, those rotations do happen, you really don't want that growth happening in a taxable account where you'll lose a chunk of it to the government every time you rebalance. You want it growing inside the Roth, where every dollar of return is yours to keep forever. The point isn't that international ETFs are guaranteed to beat US stocks. The point is that they're a way to hedge against the chance that the next decade looks very different from the last one, and in a Roth IRA, that hedge is essentially free. So how do you actually build a portfolio out of this? I told you at the start of this video that I'd touch on portfolio construction, so let me share a few simple ways to think about it. If you just want the easiest possible setup, you could literally hold one fund. VTI on its own gives you the entire US stock market in a single click. Done. You're invested in over 3,500 companies. It will not be the most exciting portfolio in the world, but it has historically beaten the vast majority of actively managed funds over any 20-year period, and it requires zero ongoing decisions from you. Sometimes the boring choice is the smart one. If you want a tiny bit more thoughtfulness without overcomplicating things, a really common setup is something like 80% VTI and 20% VXUS. This gives you broad US exposure plus that international hedge we just talked about. Two funds, One decision, and you're diversified across most of the global stock market. And if you're someone who wants to lean into higher growth and you have a long time horizon, say 20 or 30 years before you need the money, you could go with all three. Something like 60% VTI, 20% VUG or SCHG, and 20% VXUS. The VTI gives you a stable core. The Growth ETF gives you a tilt towards higher upside companies, and the International ETF gives you that global hedge. 3 funds, fully diversified, and every single dollar growing tax-free for decades. Whatever you pick, the most important thing is that you actually stick with it. Because honestly, the number one mistake I see new investors make isn't picking the wrong fund. It's switching strategies every 6 months because something else looks shinier. The boring portfolio you hold for 30 years will almost always beat the perfect portfolio you held for 6 months and then abandoned during a downturn. Before I wrap up, there are a couple of things I want to be really honest with you about. First, none of this is guaranteed. The 8 to 10% historical average return for the US stock market is exactly that, a long-term average. Some years the market goes up 25%. Some years it drops 20% or more. That 8% is what you get if you stick around for the entire ride, including the scary parts. So if you're going to invest in any of these ETFs, please don't go in expecting a smooth, straight line up. It's going to be bumpy. That's just what investing is. Second, your Roth IRA has annual contribution limits. For 2026, that's $7,500 if you're under 50 and $8,600 if you're 50 or older. Income limits also apply. If you earn more than $153,000 as a single filer or $242,000 as a married couple filing jointly in 2026, you'll start hitting phase-outs on how much you can contribute. So before you build the perfect ETF strategy, check that you're actually eligible to contribute the full amount. And third, and this is the one I really want you to take away, the best account in the world doesn't matter if you don't actually fund it. I see so many people spending hours researching the perfect ETF combination, and then they only contribute $50 here and there when they remember. The single biggest move you can make is just setting up an automatic monthly transfer from your bank to your Roth IRA. Even $300 a month gets you to most of the annual limit by the end of the year, without you having to think about it. That one habit will do more for your retirement than any clever fund pick ever could. If you found this video helpful, feel free to share it with someone who's thinking about starting their own Roth IRA. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.